My name is on top, but I also want to mention John Vervaeke here, who I've worked with to come to all of those conclusions and whose work I've heavily built on. But of course, you also have to mention a couple other concepts and names, namely metarationality by, we all know him, David Chapman, and generative rationality by Tepofilin and Köndering. Maybe you do not know those people, but I would say it's all very analogous concepts. So that's exactly what I want to also do here, like just deriving similar concepts to David Chapman's metarationality from another perspective. Yeah, the whole the whole topic I want to cover here is quite broad. Namely, who is right in the second grade rationality debate. Then I want to solve or at least formulate the problem of meaning in AI. Why Heideggerian AI isn't as ridiculous as it appears. Why Zen, Buddhism, and Taoism matter to cognitive science. The cognitive science of course teaches magic, problems with the methodology of effective altruism, and why modernity fell, and why we need meta-modernism. There's this book that's called Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, and I would similarly summarize, so either this talk is extremely repetitive, or it's incredibly dense. Usually I say when you want to go on stage, you have to have relative expertise, which means you can talk about anything, as long as you know more about than your audience. And I think that here it's the only case where I'm actually doubtful whether that's the case. So maybe I'm just summarizing everything you already know. But I'll try. Okay, let's jump right in. So, who's right? Axiomatic rationality and optimality modeling, or ecological rationality? So that's the question of the second grade rationality debate. But to understand the second grade rationality debate, we first have to understand the rationality debate, or the first rationality debate, which is partially a question of philosophy of science, but it has really dragged its way through a lot of fields. You probably know it from economics and then behavioral economics. And it is usually a tension between normative theories, models of man, and descriptive theories, like empiricism, how people actually behave. And we have normative theories of how people should behave, or how we understand just normativity around it. We derive them from decision theory, or Bayesian decision theory, game theory, logic, probability theory, and so forth. And well, descriptive theories are usually measured as exactly the deviations from those normative theories. And now the big question usually is, how do we interpret this tension, this gap, right? So there's the behaviorists who say, oh, there's an actual gap, we are not as rational as we could be, we should improve humans to close the gap. But then there's also the Panglossians that say, oh, there actually is a problem, we are as good as it gets, and the normative models have problems with them, and we have to actually change how we understand the normativity here. And I would say there's quite a creative tension in exactly both directions, right? There's a constant debate how to interpret this gap. And next to normative and descriptive, we also have prescriptions, which is the idea of what could we, assuming there is a gap, what could we do to close the gap? And historically, there were arguments that, well, people should just learn probability theory to actually apply it, or that we need more risk literacy, but also ideas like active open-mindedness and theories like that. I think Stanovich is the most famous for all those ideas in this. Yeah. The famous literature in this area is, of course, Daniel Kahneman, everything around behavioral economics. I think my favorite book about the whole research project by Kahneman and Tversky is the Undoing Project, where you not only learn the theory quite well, but also understand it in context. And there's no further literature, and the later parts are more like the fast and frugal approach to all of it. Okay, but this was more like the first rationality debate. The second completely reframed the question. So in the beginning it was, okay, there's this gap, and there's this debate of how rational are humans, right? How irrational or rational are we? But the second debate really fundamentally changed, and the question became, what even is the rationality debate? What is the rationality question? And one big advancement here was the idea of resource rationality and bounded optimality. What they did here was, okay, from just looking at ideas like probability theory and computation, we already understand that there is a level of optimality that can intrinsically just never be reached, right? Those things aren't tractable at all, ever, by no system ever. So there is an idea of kind of a bounded idea, like a maximum that any system could actually reach. So there's a lot of of the gap that's already understood just by advancement in the theory here. So that's the idea of the bounded rationality idea. And Griffith and Riedl also made many good cases how many heuristics that seem biased, once you take all those boundedness ideas into account, they are already optimal, but boundedly optimal. So I explained all of this to just show how the space gets significantly smaller, just like by decreasing the ideal here. And then if you understand that any system acts in a, of course, embedded in a real world environment, this means that whatever you do, there is there's a speed accuracy trade-off, basically, right? So the longer I think about an action, the more in the moment, first of all, of course, I have costs of the computation itself, but also I have real-world costs of opportunity costs. So if I try to save a person from bleeding out, every second I think about what I could do to save them, they might die, right? So there is this taking into the costs of real-life action into account. The net value of action is very quickly going down, where you just have to do anything. So there's this constant speed accuracy trade-off in real life, which is, I think, really interesting, because when you have a very propositional idea about rationality, the people sometimes have this idea of they should be hiding away in a room until they finally come to a conclusion of what they should be doing, right? Which, once you really understand that, of course, we are embedded, where all things are happening while we're thinking, is completely foolish, right? Once you understand all of this, you immediately understand this is foolish. You can't just hide away and not do anything, because this is your answer. Oh, I should be thinking. No, you should not. You should also really be doing. So I think, yeah, this paper really drives this home. So there's the speed accuracy trade-off. But in the work around ecological rationality, they looked way stronger at the statistical foundations, and they made the argument that the whole axiomatic rationality and behavioral economics basically has a bias, right? Because we don't just have bias as a source of error, we also have variance. They show basically that there's a bias variance dilemma, so there's multiple trade-offs, and their argument is that often simple rules are actually way more powerful against bias, because they're more robust to uncertainty conditions. So we also have an efficiency robustness trade-off on top of the speed accuracy trade-off. Yeah, and there's multiple diagrams that drive this home, where you just see the more you have, the higher uncertainty conditions you have, the more simpler approaches on average win over the more complex methods. And there's many cases about this in finance. I think Taleb makes similar arguments. And I absolutely love this paper by Brighton from 2018, which is way more than this diagram. It goes really, really deep, also in many other things that I'll mention here. But I only mention his name here, so I just want to emphasize this. Okay, so axiomatic rationality, optimality modeling, or ecological rationality of simple heuristics in an uncertain environment. Who wins, or who is more important? And yeah, I mean, the obvious answer is both. We need integration, and someone tried to do that. But to understand why, I want to go deeper into the uncertainty and optimality topic underneath, because there's a lot of literature around this as well. And the most important concept that one needs to understand is the difference between small worlds and large worlds. I think Chapman also very, very often mentions, I think, either exactly this concept or an analogous concept, but the idea is really that in statistically small idealized worlds, you can calculate the right options, right? You have a concrete, correct goal you want to go to, you can calculate how valuable each action is, and so forth. So it's all very formalized, very straightforward, and you can figure out what the optimal thing to do is. But large worlds function fundamentally differently. Savage describes this also as the difference between look before you leap versus cross the bridge when you come to it. So you get fundamentally different approaches here. And the funny thing is that all of this has already been mentioned by Knight in 1921, and also by Savage, the founder of Bayesian decision theory, right? So that things like probability theory do not work outside of small worlds. That's not like a new thing, but we actually knew it all along, because the founders of all those methods have always said this, but basically for many decades it has just been ignored and forgotten. But recently people have really rediscovered it, because, well, they figured again, oh, why doesn't it work? Well, we knew it all along that it doesn't. And my favorite talk to watch about all of this is by Ken Binmore. making decisions in large worlds. You can find it on YouTube. And what's really pleasurable about watching this talk is that he has met many of the people he mentions in person. I don't know whether it was from Newman, but like most of the other people he has actually met, and it's just wonderful to just be reminded that in the end it's all humans that have done the thinking, right? It's not Platonic ideas. In the end, it's all work humans have done. And one of the most recent works related to the topic is by Kay and King, Radical Uncertainty. They also have fantastic podcasts if you want to cut it short, where you get all the information in 1 hour. And David Marr, the very famous cognitive scientist, has also already differentiated between type 1 and type 2 theories, where exactly, right, one is easily computable, while the other is the kind of the it itself is the shortest representation of how to solve it. Exactly. Here's a quote from Savage again, from the Foundation of Statistics. So even what he says, even planning a picnic or playing a game of chess in accordance with the principles of Bayesian decision theory would be utterly out of our power and utterly ridiculous, right? So he already said that. And here's what David Marr said. Again, so what's the difference between type 1 and type 2 theories? In one case, the interactions of those processes are their own simplest description, right? You can see here. So there's just a world of idealization, and then there's the real world, and in the real world, well, all those formal methods really have very strong limitations. There's way more you can read about all of this. One of my favorite papers is The Interpretation of Uncertainty in Ecological Rationality by Kozirova and Hertwig, which is just like really a fabulous read. And the main arguments, again and again, are uncertainty is not measurable, you're not in a small world, and we have further argumentations like the no free lunch theorems, in general computational irreducibility, and the problem of underdetermination in model selection, right? You just cannot know what the right thing is in the real world. Instead, we have to think about uncertainty as being systemic, and it is a system between the organism and the environment, so it's semiotic, and we always face multiple trade-offs at the same time. By the way, I listen to podcasts in twice the speed, so I try to also give you this impression here. Let's see how it works. Okay, the next topic, or what follows from all of this, because uncertainty is not measurable, but a systemic property of an organism and its environment, it's semiotic, and as a result we have to look at the frame problem. Because, well, we have the problem of optimality and the problem of robustness at the same time. So to solve those multiple trade-offs at the same time, we have to, in this large world that we are in, we have to continuously create small world abstractions in, well, this open-ended world of reality. And then in these abstractions we can use formal methods, but we have to also look outside of the abstractions and into the real world again. Who of you knows the example of the robot from Vervaeke? Oh wow, okay, I'm pleased, I thought everyone else. Okay. So to illustrate the problem of the frame problem, there's a story by a robot that John Vervaeke tells, but it's famously by Daniel Dennett. It's this idea, okay, let's build a robot that is able to find its own energy source, right? And the energy source, the battery, is on a little wagon. But the problem is, there's also a bomb on the wagon. So now, it would have to, like whenever it wants to take an action, it has to, at every step, think about, could I make a complete list of all the unintended side effects, right? Like, because if it would take the battery, the bomb would also fall down and everyone would die, or at least the robot would die, so it would not be able to reach its goal. So it's like, okay, I want to get the battery on the wagon, but with every step, could there be an unintended side effect? So at every point in time, I would have to make a complete list of what could happen that should not happen, right? And this creates this problem of this infinite regress, because at every step, I have to have a complete list of everything that I don't want and everything that I do want. So how do I narrow in on being able to take any action in the end? And yeah, this infinite regress, or this combinatorial explosion of possibilities of things that could happen, And in the end, I need this meta-induction to like, when do I stop, right? When do I stop thinking about possible side effects? What should I focus on? What should I not focus on? When should I just look at the wagon and just go for the battery? And every time, which rule do I follow? And there's no fundamental ground to stand on where it's like I always go for the battery, or you can't even have a full list of all the unintended side effects. So how do you build such a thing, right? That's exactly the frame problem. How do you narrow it down to actually take an action? And Savage, again, in Foundations of Statistics, already wrote about this problem as we have to artificially confine our attention to so small a world that the look before you leap principle can be applied there. But the problem is that you cannot formulate a general criteria for selecting such a small world, right? There is no general rule for what to narrow down on. So how can this even work in this continuously process of living? How do you make the decision of how to decide? Well, this is also the problem of generative rationality. So this has come now to the forefront in multiple fronts. And here the problem is exactly again that this is the theoretical underpinning. So in ecological rationality, they had a psychophysics view of the world, which means you had a passive uptake from the environment of statistical information, and then once you could identify what environment you're in, given the environment, you can take a specific action, right? But this has multiple problems because, well, what environment are you in right now? Are you in a multi-agent environment right now? Or what is the game you're playing right now, right? There is no external description of what your problem is right now. It's a constant creation, and this is exactly just this switch from the Brunswick lens model to Uexküll's Umwelt. So Uexküll talks about the life world of a tick. It describes that, of course, a tick in the world experiences everything around it very differently. It will have a world of significance where anything that's filled with blood or warm will be significant to it or meaningful to it, while everything else is in the background, right? So whoever you are, you have a very different Umwelt, given who you are, what your goals are, what your preferences are, and what your experiences are, and so forth. So there is no statistical external world that you just have to process and then react to, but it is a constant semiotic creation of a meaningful world to you. So this is this shift from psychophysics and cognitivism to this more 4E and activism approach as well. And Fiedler and Kundering basically last year published this big paper on the generative view of rationality, and they showed, for example, exactly how cues cannot necessarily just be represented, but sometimes, for example, that something is not in the environment can be a cue. There's, for example, this famous story by Sherlock Holmes where the dog is not barking. Do you know the story? Exactly, right? So the dog in this context is not barking, but he understands that this is a sign, right? That if you have a passive view of psychophysics, this is not possible. Something not being there cannot be the cue. Do you want to say something?
Oh no, I just know the story. It's like it was like a criminal who came to this house to rob it, but like he walked by this dog that barked at everybody who it didn't know, and the fact that the dog didn't bark at this person suggested that like he was intimately familiar and was like the key thing in that. It's just like a loud signal that's loud by its absence. Sorry.
Exactly, and I find it also brilliant that they use the story to make their case for a fundamental shift in cognitive science and how we understand rationality, to exactly go from this cue-based view to actually growing awareness to cues, right? Like, so often, I mean, while we go through the world, we also have not yet, they talk about taming or teaming the environment, right? You have to, there's just often a surprise, right? Something is off, but you don't even know what it is yet.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Here? It's just like coming up in my heart. Like, what's the loudest absent signal right now in whatever late capitalist, like late Western culture is? Like for you, what is the loudest absent signal that is like, especially after this last period, like COVID and isolation and your reinvention, are you seeing as like the loudest thing that is speaking because it's not there?
It's probably already too cliche to even say it, but meaning. That would definitely be the answer.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, right on point, I guess. Okay, generative rationality, back to that. A book that's also very close to the generative rationality perspective is by Donald Hoffman, who talks about the interface theory of perception. I don't know whether you know that argument. But he basically speaks about how evolution has hidden the truth from us, which I find a terrible frame personally. But what he just says is it's not even advantageous to see the truth about the environment, which doesn't even make sense to me anymore. But that of course you see things in a way that you can act on them, right? You have an interface to reality that presents it so that you can act on it. I think Peterson would again say we don't see objects and infer meaning, we see meaning and infer objects, right? So the meaning comes first, the interface to reality comes first. So Peterson would say you don't see a door and then decide to walk through it, you see a walk through it and then infer, okay, it's a door, right? So the action or the relevance to your own action comes first. It's an interface. Okay, and then my case, the next point to generative rationality is what is the underlying mechanism, and that's of course relevance realization. So in the environment we have to solve multiple trade-offs at the same time. Here, right, you have efficiency, robustness, or resiliency, generalization, specialization, focusing and diversifying, and all those oppositional processes have to be managed at the same time. Or relevance realization is realized by oppositional processes. And this comes down to the problem of meaning, right? So here's an example from Hill from DeepMind, where he shows, okay, what is the problem here in those two red rectangles?
W can also be confused for an EV.
Yes, exactly. So in this case, you basically, what you see in the red rectangle basically looks exactly the same, but you of course can read it very differently depending on where it stands. But you have to have both the top-down and bottom-up process at the same time to understand the individual representation, right? So I have to, first of all, understand letters, but I also have to read the sentence to then understand that the first one is went, and the other one is event. So I have to top-down understand the letters, but also read the sentence, and by both processes, I can narrow down what the meaning in context is. And this is original from Rumelhart from 1976, and he talks exactly about this interactive model of reading, where you need both at the same time. But it's also relevant now in AI, because, well, it's exactly those problems that what something means in context, like you have to understand it in context, but you also have to understand the individual representation to come at it from both sides, basically. And this is the same, of course, in real life, right? Like with every action I take, the action itself could mean something completely different in a different context, but I have to understand the context to understand the particular instance, but also the other way around. So it's always this, the circular process. And the literature is quite broad. There's many people who make similar points. So, for example, Douglas Hofstadter talks about it in the problem of language and categorization, but also there's Melanie Mitchell. They talk about the problem of analogy. And I'd really like to mention Peterson in this category as well, who, to be honest, gave a very by now a very similar account of all of this. So I'm like, why should I even talk about this? Because he already makes the point and has so many people listening to it. But coming back to Douglas Hofstadter, so he talks about language, right? Like how do we call an object depends a lot on the context. So whether I call a table depends on if it's in use right now. But if I'm moving, right, then I might just call it, oh, the piece of furniture. Can you move the piece of furniture into the vehicle or something? But if I sit on it, it's a table, of course. Or if it gets really, really cold, suddenly it might become pieces of wood, right? So how I abstract from it depends on the context, even though it is one thing in a sense. the same argument can be made for why things do not have constant value. This is often made as a case for why we're biased, because we value one thing differently in one context versus another. So in the typical irrationality literature, when behavioral economics was famous, they would, for example, say, oh, it's so irrational that on a plane you would pay $50 for a burger, while before and after you would only pay like $10, right? So this is so irrational, and suddenly the context changes everything. But of course, context is everything, because but maybe you would never even be interested in the fruit ever, or you'd be like, yeah, okay, whatever, I pay like 50 cents or so for being able to eat it. But okay, but now you learn that it contains a substance that you need to cure the disease that your partner has. Suddenly you would give probably all your savings, right? Like suddenly there's a complete shift, and the same thing has a completely different meaning in the new context. So I would say the whole understanding of this constant idea of meaning is useful, right? Like if there's things that are relatively stable, we do relatively stable value oxygen, we do relatively stably value in general having enough calories to eat and things like that. But for many other things, it is really a very a meaning creation question, how we value things, and the economics model would totally not work here at all. A person that already talked, oh my god, I'm so sorry. A person that has also talked about similar topics, and in our program, they would often talk about Heidegger in the context of AI, and back then I was 100% in the cognitivist paradigm, and I would just be like, oh my god, of course they want to use fancy words, it doesn't make any sense. But here I am having to admit it does actually sadly make sense. So one example they make, or he makes, is about tool use, right? Like, so you could, in the cognitivist framework or paradigm, you could say, okay, agent uses tool and then does something with the tool. But in the phenomenology of how we actually use a tool, once I pick something up and use it as a tool, actually the tip of the tool becomes the end of my own hand, right? It's very different in how I perceive it. Suddenly, the tool becomes part of me. And Vervaeke actually has a paper about a rover on Mars, and how the scientists that steer it also feel like they're actually like sitting in there. They feel like the Mars surface, right? Because you have this extended cognition as well, and the embodiment, where you feel like, oh, I can really feel how it shakes over the surface, even though I'm physically not connected, but my mind's connected to it. And even something as far away as a robot on Mars can become the tip of my finger, basically. So it's this whole activist understanding, and Heidegger was already talking about it. And to go back, or to go deeper, the main problem is, of course, that axiomatic rationality tried to do the same as Bertrand Russell with the foundations of mathematics, right? Like, where are the axioms we can stand on, from which we can finally do everything and are omnipotent in the world? But turns out it's turtles all the way down, also in rationality. And this is actually where Buddhism comes in, because they have this concept of groundlessness, right? That whatever you feel like is given can change from every second to the next. And that's why you need this idea of non-dual awareness, where you look through a concept and use it as a tool, but then you also notice where it doesn't fit and you can let it go again. Do you want to say something?
No, I was just liking you.
Yeah, thanks. And similarly, Taoism talks about the Tao that can be described is not the eternal Tao, and the name that can be spoken is not the eternal name. Where again you have this idea of, it probably means many other things as well, but you also have the idea of, well, you can use ideas to understand things, to do things, but once you take it too literal, you think it represents the thing completely, it loses its power, actually. So it's just taking it seriously, but also letting it go again. And someone who actually was in my study program, and I'm very grateful for, wrote a wonderful paper about it called Knowing Groundlessness, an active approach to a shift from cognition to non-dual awareness, where he does exactly that, like bring the idea of groundlessness from Buddhism into the current cognitive science exchange. Okay, we continue to the idea of insight. Okay, so we're in a large world, where we constantly have to solve the frame problem, ignore most of the things, focus on the things we need to take action. And once we have actually abstracted from the world, we can use it to, in the abstraction, search for insight. The most famous example is the 9-dot problem. Who does not know the 9-dot problem? Or who knows the 9-dot problem? Okay. Okay, so the idea is that you have 9 dots, and your job is to connect them with 4 lines that are all connected to one another. I already made the wrong movement to help you solve it. Okay, so yeah, right, you can try it, and you feel like, oh, I always miss 1 dot, until you finally come to the conclusion what works, namely, you have to think outside the box. Which I think is literally where this phrase comes from. So the idea is that you had kind of, when you looked at the problem and tried to solve it, you already had a notion of how you will probably be able to solve it. But once you were able to break your first idea and your frame of how to do it, you were able to actually do it, right? There's this moment where you shift from, I had this notion, and it's not correct, and I have to let it go, and now I'm able to act. This is this moment of insight where suddenly, because you reformulate the problem, you can act in a new way. Similarly, there's this example of a chessboard that is covered with 32 domino stones. And now we take away 2 fields from the chessboard, and the question is, can we cover it with 31 domino stones completely? Who thinks yes? Who thinks we can cover it? Who thinks we cannot? Do you want to argue why?
Black and white.
Exactly. Okay, so this is completely exactly. There you see inside an action. So when you hear the problem for the first time and look at it, you will start like actually like, okay, can I, right? Like you will try it out. It takes forever. It's very intractable. You could maybe do it like with real stones to make it quicker, but it really takes a long time. But once you understand, okay, every domino stone has to cover a black and a white one, and we're taking away diagonal pieces, so we take away 2 white ones, so it cannot work. Right? So you reformulate the problem, and suddenly what became like became, oh, of course, right? And this is the moment of insight where something fits together, connects, and now you're able to completely solve the problem very smoothly. Anderson and Vervaeke talk about exactly that, right? You have a frame that doesn't work, it breaks down, you go deeper to chaos, but now a new frame establishes, and now you have more order. You complexify your way of interacting with the world, and you have better fittedness to your environment, right? You fit more understanding about the environment and the situation you're in into your understanding, and you can exert more like optimal grip, right? You can act in a different way by having this new connectedness and insight. And the idea is that exactly right, that you have to abstract small worlds, and then usually you can use this abstraction to come to insights in the small world abstractions. So when you think, for example, about chess, which is very easy to formalize, or poker, or we can understand what's game theory optimal in poker because we can abstract it so well, because it is quite easy to formalize. And then you can, because you can abstract from it, actually train it way better, and then come back to the game and play it in a new way. And this is exactly this idea of small word abstraction, insight in the abstraction, or new problem formulation, and then a new frame and better way of acting in the world. Transformation. Okay, and there we come exactly to the cognitive science of 4D chess and magic. But first wanted to bring this wonderful picture here to explain again what 4D chess is. I think this was exactly the situation where everyone was like, he's probably playing 4D chess. This is the context where I heard it the most, personally. So and it's exactly this idea, right? You might sit down at a poker game, and a poker game is quite easy to, like, it's very, very complex to actually understand what's game theory optimal in poker, but it is quite, like, relatively easy to formalize, and then you can actually train to become very good at it. But what if you sit at a poker game, and you play poker, but my game is to, well, I don't know, become your friend, to in the long run, collaborate with you, or maybe I just wanted to lure you in to, well, kill you, right? Maybe the thing that's actually going on is in the environment. You might win the game, but you completely miss the real game that's going on, which is, oh, you're physically vulnerable in the situation of playing poker, right? So you have one frame, I have a different frame, and this is the idea of what is happening. But this is exactly the idea of 4D chess. And this comes back to all the literature about strategies, where you often, right, in the 48 laws of power, you often have laws that are completely contradictory to one another. Same as the stratagems. I always like, here he says do this, here he says do that. To this, I was struggling with this literally for years, which is so embarrassing. Like, okay, you say this, but you say also the opposite. Like, this does not make. Can you just tell me what to do? Like, what is the right thing to do, right? And I had to understand the idea of relevance realization, the frame problem, to understand. Well, it depends on the context, what is relevant, because sometimes you need opposite strategies, right? But if I shoot away the weaponry of my enemy in the first attempt, well, sometimes this might be the right thing to do, but sometimes this might mean I'm out of my own weapons in the second strike, right? So should I keep my weapons for later? It depends. It really depends on what I think the other strategy is, and so forth. So this really illustrates quite well exactly this idea of relevance realization, where you have to bring all those things together. I really like the idea of, well, let's say you want to build some how do you say it, some streets. So you're thinking about optimal network flow, right? You can use graph theory to abstract from it, and then you can calculate optimal network flow. But somehow, it just doesn't work. Like somehow, people, like the vehicles get stuck, even though you have 100% calculated this correctly. Like you try it again, you have calculated it correctly, and then turns out, well, you would have needed a biologist and not someone that does graph theory, because there's some animals crossing over your perfect abstraction, and therefore the abstraction just doesn't work, right? This again drives home also the idea of multiple perspectives, because a biologist would be like, yeah, of course, right? I know there's this species, and they always cross the streets at this time, so doesn't work like that. Even though the mathematician's like, I've calculated like 100% correct, right? So this is why you need different perspectives, and something can happen on a completely different level of reality. And sadly, in reality, everything is everywhere, all at once. I also really like this example from XKCD. Which, again, brings home exactly the same problem, that one person is in this frame of perfect technology. I know I'm the best in technology, nobody could do it better, but, well, the others don't even play your game, right? So this is kind of, from their perspective, this is 4D chess. And the perfect picture is, of course, the flat land idea, right? So you are in the 2D perspective, you abstract in a certain way, but, well, there's more perspectives, more parts to reality, and you can outplay someone on other levels of reality that are otherwise completely invisible to you. Okay, all of this fits together quite nicely with the current newest idea in cognitive science, namely predictive processing, which talks about, well, that exactly, perception is not the passive uptake from the environment, but an active generation of, well, sense making of the environment. And one, completely ignore the formalisms, they're really not relevant, but and one part of it is the idea of precision weighting, that I treat some parts of reality as more certain and precise than others. And this is exactly this trade-off between this optimality versus robustness, right? When something is extremely uncertain, then just like very simple actions will free me out of it. But if I can actually abstract something as very, very certain, or like very clearly, well, understandable, like a poker game, a chess game, then I should treat it as very, very precise and calculate accordingly. That's also where, again, all the ideas from axiomatic rationality come in really handy. You do need probability theory if you want to play poker, or if, yeah, you'd want to do finance. You do need it, but you have to really understand where the limitations are, otherwise you lose in 4D chess. John Vervaeke also brings all of this quite well together with Brett Anderson and Mark Miller in their paper Predictive Processing and Relevance Realization, where they also talk about how you can understand computational psychiatry in this context, namely different disorders or symptoms like autism and psychosis are basically different ways of making the trade-offs. You treat everything as extremely clear, like, oh my god, I see a pattern everywhere, versus I'm extremely overwhelmed and like, whoa, stimuli everywhere. Right? Like, one is more the autism and one is the schizotypy. So they really bring all of this together, which again I find marvelous. Like when you just can connect many things so precisely in one framework, that's exactly where insight happens. And read it yourself; it's really good. And of course, we know Chapman, who basically has said literally everything what I said just earlier. I, by the way, always made it like I knew he existed, but I really didn't want to read him because I was fearful that he would say what I would come to as well. And later it turned out, yeah, this is exactly what happened. So I feel like I really worked all the way there, but it was like, okay, someone has already found all of this. Great, but I guess it also is good when you know you've actually derived it independently because it actually strengthens the point, of course. And he talks about in the cells of the eggplant where it's exactly this question, well, is there water in the refrigerator? And it depends. Does someone want to drink something? Then there is no bottle of water in there. But if you're a chemist or you want to put something very explosive in there that reacts with any trace of water, then, well, there is an eggplant in the refrigerator, so yes, there is water in the cells of the eggplant, which shows exactly this problem of, is water in the refrigerator? There is no one true answer, but it depends on context and it depends on goals, which is exactly... exactly. Thank you so much. Yes. He talks about exactly that. Okay, but he also talks about the different stages of development. So rationality, or like the axiomatic formal approach, is this systematic stage. It's level 4. But there's also this idea of meta systematicity, or fluid mode, namely stage 5, where you understand that we do need this formal understanding, we do need to be able to understand systems, like if you want to play poker, you do really need the system, you will not beat people if you do not understand it, but you also have to understand where they end, you have to fluidly be able to move between them, and well, this is where we should all be, be getting to at some point. He also talks about the idea of like, well, the processes that get you there. So from the stage 3 communal mode, there's multiple levels or like ways how you can develop to a stage 4, for example, via employment, or sometimes via the humanities, but usually via STEM education. And then there's stages like the recognition of nebulosity, and often then this nihilistic STEM depression, or which you might overcome to stage 5, where you have this meta-rational understanding, or well, as the humanities, you might end in this ultra-relativist homo-nihilism. And I think underlying is a good concept to understand. What's underlying is the idea of Wittgenstein's ladder, who says that often you need a proposition to, well, take the next step, right? But once you look back, the proposition is completely meaningless and ridiculous, but you needed it to go forward step by step. And so, for example, a lot of science, philosophy of science, once you understood the limitations, it's actually ridiculous. Now when I go back to reading the empiricist literature, I'm like, no, really no, but I needed it to first go to the scientific or stage 4 mode. And someone who also talks about this is Paul Taggart, who talks about the cognitive science of science, where he talks about how often a science education really does shape your worldview, and this is not a process of I learn one fact and another fact, but really a deep conceptual shift that really comes with like really deep embodied feelings, right? Where you really feel like, oh my god, my sense of meaning in the world breaks down. This happened, for example, at our cognitive science conference, where many people through the cognitive science education fell out of the scientism, right? They understood, oh, there's so many limitations, you can abstract from things in multiple ways, there is no objective truth, and you could see that everyone was kind of depressed, because we were all at the stage where we had to leave the scientistic worldview and really understand the limitations, but we weren't at stage 5 yet, and you could just see that everyone who came there, like, yeah, I want to understand the mind, like how the mind objectively works. They were just really like down, like they were not like some, a new fact, but like really could feel it in everyone's presence. And Paul Taggart talks about it. How it would be actually great with therapists while you study, because it will really often shake your worldview as well, right? Because you also take it out of context into your own life. What does it mean for my own life if there is no ultimate ground to stand on? It means a lot usually. Well, and actually, I hope I'm not completely overdoing this here. Effective altruism makes the same mistake, to my mind. I would say they have a Marian confusion, which means in the tree-level analysis by Marr, there's this computational level, right? The function of the function you want to solve, but there's also an algorithm of how you do it, and then of course the implementation. And I would say that effective altruism and a lot of analytic philosophy basically think that formalizing the question is the process by which you solve the problem. Once I've calculated in my mind how many animals there are, by doing so I also solve the problem of helping them all. But often the formalism and the process by which I get there are very distinct. Kay and King, for example, talk about the problem in finance and business, how if someone has a great business plan, right, a great formalization, this is often not a good sign that they will actually execute a great business. But what you actually want is the process of someone being really obsessed of creating a good product, which will get you to hopefully a lot of profit too, also not always, but more often than just having a great business plan that has certain key terms in it, right? So those things are quite decoupled, and I think especially effective altruism is way too much stuck on this very decision-theoretic, propositional level of understanding. I think often a lot of knowledge about the processes is usually outside of the community, and this is where personally I'm way more now, where I feel like people actually have more knowledge of how to actually solve certain things, right, as a process, not just an understanding or formalization of the problem. Here. Similarly, I was super passionate about quantified self for some time, and I felt like, oh, if I just track all my data, at some point the answer will fall out, right? And I will learn everything about myself. But of course, again, collecting data about yourself, it has to be used in an ongoing process for insight, right? You look at the data, look at how you have made progress towards a goal, and then from the information you can learn, you can gain a new insight about how to interact with the world. One of the biggest insights for me and for many, I think, for example, around fitness was just, well, I have to eat enough protein to, in general, eat less, and just, well, this is the one thing I have to focus on in all my health, like one of the most important heuristics. But I first had to track everything to come to this very simple insight, and then I could interact with the world in a new way, which is very different than thinking I can just track everything and then make sense out of everything. And of course, when you apply to politics and the world, this all brings us back to metamodernism. The problem of modernity was same as with stage 4, that we had this idea of a perfect system, a perfect understanding of how the world should be, and then we tried to actually press reality into that system and kill everything that's outside of the system. And this completely defied the laws of nature and of society, and that's why it failed catastrophically. And people that make similar arguments are, of course, James Scott, who talks about high modernism, where, yeah, exactly, you try to top-down manage complex reality. Or, well, I think Nassim Taleb talks about something similar, and Herb Simon also talks about exactly the problems of administrative behavior, abstractions of reality versus how things actually work. And of course, the problem is in seeing like a state in high modernism that often when you try to just abstract from something and then control it, you ignore all the embodied knowledge that particular people in particular contexts have that work for their environment, and you cannot just like completely atomize the individual, put it back somewhere else, and it will just magically work. The world is way more complex. I think complexity science also helps a lot next to meta-rationality to see the limitations here. Exactly, so we have to get to meta-modernism. There's fantastic literature, as many of you probably know, for example from Hansi Freinacht. And that was basically my talk. All the questions I tried to answer, hope you're satisfied. And two people that also talk about very similar topics are Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke in this conversation. That's it.